unfortunately, we have to start the show in a place that's not all that fun, Perloff, because Jalen Carter, the standout defensive lineman from Georgia, the two-time national champion, is now leaving the NFL scouting combine.
Yeah.
He is heading back to Athens because there is a warrant out for his arrest. He's been charged with reckless driving and racing, and this all stems from a fatal accident that happened on January 15th, which was the night of the Georgia Bulldogs championship parade. We know that offensive lineman Devin Willock and Chandler LaCroix, who was a staffer for the Georgia Bulldogs, a recruitment staffer, were driving in a car at a high rate of speed, over 100 miles an hour. They crashed into a telephone pole, and they were both killed. We just found out last night, because of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that Jalen Carter was not only present at the scene of the accident, but that he was also driving in a car where they were racing and really just driving incredibly recklessly. According to the police report, he at first misled police officers. First, he left the scene of the crime, according to the police report, came back 2 hours later and said that he had just heard the crash from a apartment building nearby. Obviously, that was a lie. They found out that it was not true, and now he is being charged with reckless driving.
Yeah, I mean, Jalen Carter did put out a statement himself saying that he's going to be exonerated of all these charges. So we have to let the legal process play out a little bit. But to me, what really strikes me is the timing. It's March 1st. He was about a half hour from going up on the podium and addressing the entire NFL media, just like so many other players have been done. Obviously, no, he didn't expect it to be now. He knew his involvement. There's just it's a big surprise because he's one of the few names really that is standing out in Indianapolis. People want to hear him. They want to know who he is because he's supposed to be the best player. Then the other thing, too, is Kirby Smart, the Georgia coach, comes out and says that he was really alarmed by the facts and implying that they didn't know the extent of Jalen Carter's involvement. Okay, whatever. But
more college coaches kind of thinking that they don't know anything.
It feels like the first jolt of chaos into this draft process. I mean, not that the draft is the most important thing in this story, but it just puts it off balance because it's not a great draft at the top. It's not. There's no Trevor Lawrence. There's no sure thing quarterback. So Jalen Carter was a de facto best player. Now that's all up in the air, isn't it?
Well, definitely. I mean, and you're bringing back, this bringing to light the fact that this star player was present in this tragic situation. It's impossible not to see the correlation that not just the NFL draft is going to be clouded by the news that we got today, but also the NBA draft with Brandon Miller and what went on at the University of Alabama with that fatal shooting. And so the NFL draft and the NBA draft are both going to be clouded by these top prospects who were not directly involved in these deaths, but are right there. I mean, at the scene of the crime, involved to a certain extent, but in one case, Jalen Carter is getting charged with something. Brandon Williams is not getting charged with anything. And it's sad that we're talking about people who lost their lives. It is awful. And then for the sports side of it, I mean, it's kind of fascinating how much are teams going to be willing to look the other way, explain it away? Are we going to see these guys both fall in the draft because of these issues, or are teams going to shrug their shoulders and say, you know what, the talent is worth it, even though it looks like the decision-making of these two young men was terrible at the time, we're going to overlook it because of their talent.
Yeah, I think that obviously, as you mentioned, the situations are different.
Yeah.
The legal process might affect this with Jalen Carter. Teams might want to see what happens here.
Right. So, the two charges are misdemeanors, we should mention. So
2 charges for now.
Right. It seems very unlikely that he would serve jail time.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it seems very unlikely that this will all be settled by the end of April when the draft is.
Great point.
I think my sense, and I'm not an expert on this story, but it seems like Brandon Miller's story is over. And there's going to be teams are going to look at him and say, from a legal standpoint, there's no arrest here. He was never charged with anything. I think the fact that Jalen Carter is being charged makes it a kind of a different thing for teams. So they have to make a decision by the end of April. They're really going to, I think they already did. I think they all know about this, but they're really going to have to send their security staffs down to Georgia and find out, okay, what really happened here?
Right.
What kind of person is this? Because at that level, I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the draft.
You're investing millions of dollars into these guys. Absolutely.
And not to mention blown opportunity. I mean, not to get into the breakdown of the draft, but to me, he's not a quarterback anyway. So teams are going to let him fall. Is there any non-quarterback, unless you're a pass rusher or a quarterback?
Yeah.
You don't have to take a number one. I mean, there's no defensive tackles that have gone number one in decades. So I think it's going to be easy for teams to move on because of that position.
Yeah, I mean, but here's the thing. Well, at some point, somebody is going to select both of these guys. And it's going to be interesting, like how much we talk about the pre-draft process, but how much do you really get a chance to know somebody? And how can you say, like, man, this person, and granted, they are very young people. They're young, and you make dumb decisions when you're, hell, some people make dumb decisions when they're old. But how do you extrapolate whether or not you want to bring this person into your building? Because whether it's the number 1 overall pick in the draft, Perloff, or 15 or 30, or he drops to the second round, or who knows, but at some point the person becomes part of your organization, and do you trust that they are going to not make bad decisions, or is this the wake-up call of their lives? Hey, I need to be making better decisions.
Well, it happens with every player, though, doesn't it? And then the funny thing, too, Maggie, it's hard to tell what's this person going to be like once he becomes a pro, once he gets paid. You have to, especially at that level of the draft. I mean, can you imagine? I heard some comparisons, totally not what happened, but comparisons to teams looking at Jameis Winston coming out of Florida State,
sure,
who was still, and the question also came up, will the NFL have to suspend Jalen Carter? Most precedent seems like they will not jump into that arena. So, because he was still at Georgia when this happened, he hadn't declared for the draft. But I think you have to do that with every player, and this is just an extreme example. Maybe it's easier with Jalen Carter because you could kind of tell what you get him in your building. You ask him, "Hey, what happened here?" Would you want to hear his reaction to it?
Well, it's not just about the misleading police officers. Yeah. I mean, if that's indeed true, that is not a good decision. Yeah. But the drag racing in itself, or the racing in itself, I mean, listen, I'm not naive. I know that this happens all over the country, but to be doing that and, trying to outrace someone where you're going maybe 100 miles an hour, I mean, nothing good is going to come of this, obviously. So that decision-making has to get called into question as well. One
more tentacle of this.
Yeah.
The Bears have already said they wanted to trade out of the number 1 pick. Right. Ryan Poles. So presumably they need they need help everywhere, but they need defensive help. Now, if you're calling the Bears seem to have no leverage at the number 1. If I'm Houston, and maybe you say, well, obviously, we know you don't want that pick. We know you don't even want Jalen Carter. The Bears are going to try and get down there. I don't know. I'm sort of playing hardball with the Bears because the Bears are probably pretty desperate to get out of that spot. Who's the pick for them if they're not going to take a quarterback?
They have to hope that somebody falls in love with Bryce Young, or maybe somehow does C.J. Stroud end up taking over Bryce Young as the top prospect? I don't know.
Anthony Richardson, Will Levis, maybe,
but I don't know what they're going to do between now and then that's going to get them to jump Bryce Young.
But there is one other player. I think Will Anderson, the Alabama pass rusher, is considered in play for that number 1 pick.
Totally.
So maybe if the Bears get sucked, they go that direction instead of Jalen Carter. But how shocked would you be if Carter remains in the top 2 or 3?
Well, it depends what happens.
Yeah,
it really does.
Point.
I mean, listen, I can call into question the decision-making. Ultimately, though, I need to talk to the young man. I need to figure out what he's about and, figure out what happened, as much as you possibly can. Yeah. It is just an awful situation, really. And now he is, again, leaving the scouting combine to go back to Georgia to face these charges. Now, he says he's going to be exonerated, so we'll see. 855-212-4CBS, 855-212-4227. I should also mention there were 2 other people who were in the car. I did not mention that before. Offensive lineman Warren McClendon, who's also declared for the draft, and Victoria Bowles, who was another staffer for Georgia. They both sustained injuries, hers worse than his, but they also sustained injuries. I want to make sure we're right about that.